Hello and welcome to the Onyx Path. Uh, I'm Travis Legge. My pronouns are he, him, and they, and I have the extreme pleasure of discussing our They Came From double feature tonight with the line developer of the They Came From games, Matthew Dawkins. Matthew, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule and especially as it is evening there in the UK, and I know you're supposed to be like brooding in a castle somewhere near the ocean. But I appreciate you taking the time to be near an internet connection to talk with us.
Well, I've been drinking, and I've got a lot to tell you in particular, Travis. I would have rather not done it in front of a live audience, but you can't choose. So let me get started. And so that's Scarred Lands. No, I've not been drinking. It's a Wednesday night, and as everyone knows, I drink on a Thursday night. So what that means is, yes, I'm here, I'm clean, I'm sober, and I'm here to talk about They Came From Classified and They Came From the Cyclops' Cave. I am the line developer of the They Came From line. Hell, I'm the conceptualist of the They Came From line. However, I co-developed They Came From the Cyclops' Cave with the very talented Michele Marsala, who I understand you intend to interview at another point. I recommend lots of people check that out because Michele is a very interesting individual with a lot of fantastic thoughts. But yeah, it's the They Came From Kickstarter right now, our double feature, where you can back one or another one or two different They Came From games. And don't feel restricted. You know, you can do one or you can do both. Want to make that absolutely clear. And we've hit funding. So that's good news. As soon as we hit funding, that's it. Our target is done. We're happy, but anything else we can get, we are even more happy with, because as everyone knows by now, it goes on to fund additional books in the line, more stretch goals and so forth. So if you haven't backed already, maybe this Q&A, this chat will convince you. And if you have any questions for me, ideally about They Came From, but not necessarily, if you have any questions for me whatsoever, fair or foul, feel free to pose them, and Travis will try and keep an eye on them.
Absolutely, yeah. If you do have a question in the chat, it helps me immensely if you type question in all caps beforehand, so I know that I need to earmark that to ask later on. So please, questions are encouraged. But before we dive too far into it, and I do definitely want to talk about both the lines that are currently on the Kickstarter as well as some of the other They Came From games. I do want to just take a moment. Somebody had asked me earlier, I was speaking about getting ready to do this, and I really want to take a moment and just sing the praises of Cyclops' Cave. This is the game I wanted when I was 5 watching cartoons on Saturday mornings. It might be my favorite role-playing game. And I feel also compelled to inform the audience, you know, this is my former journalism student coming out. I have not worked on either of these two books. In fact, I have only officially worked on one book for They Came From at this point. So I've had the pleasure of being able to engage it largely as a fan. And I want to thank you for making Cyclops' Cave. It is incredible, and I will make sure that I extend that thanks next week to your co-developer when they come over on the channel as well. So yeah, absolutely, thank you. This is it is awesome. It is super cool.
I had no idea, and I'm delighted that you think so. An awful lot of that credit does go to Michele, but the entire creative team. And yeah, it's a game that's ideal for 5-year-olds and people all the way up to 99. Anyone over that age should probably have stopped role-playing by now. I'm not ageist, but I think there comes a point where you need to bow out gracefully. And They Came From the Cyclops' Cave luckily spans a large age range, a wide age range, if you will. And yeah, because unlike any of the other They Came From, Cyclops' Cave covers multiple subgenres within a genre. And I mean, you could argue that Beneath the Sea does that with different branches of sci-fi, but I think it is perceived as being entirely about aquatic invasions, largely as a result of the name. Cyclops' Cave is everything from epic fantasy, sword and sandals, Sinbad, Odysseus, Clash of the Titans, very Harryhausen stuff, through to sword and sorcery, the Sword and the Sorcerer, Kroll, Hawk the Slayer, Conan, and so on. And then you get into the TV fantasy side of Hercules and Xena, and some various other dodgy offerings that were appearing in the early 90s before fantasy got critically seen as, oh, okay, this can be good with the Lord of the Rings movies. We kind of stop the inspiration list as we get into the Lord of the Rings, because we all acknowledge Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings movies were very, very good. They helped inform probably most of the people watching this or who have read a role-playing game in the last 30 years. But before that, fantasy was always seen as a bit like horror, a bit like sci-fi, as a second or third tier of media, which was unfair. There's some excellent fantasy out there, but there's also Masters of the Universe, the movie. There's there's a lot of for the Onyx Pathcast today, we did a watch along of Hercules and the Haunted World, which basically was Hercules versus vampires.
Right.
Christopher Lee was in it. That was a surprise. There was a 1961 movie starring Christopher Lee as a vampire. I think this was pre-Hammer horror. So
that's amazing.
Yeah. So yeah, there's good movies, there's bad movies, but I think a lot of us who got into role-playing got into it through Dungeons and Dragons, but before Dungeons and Dragons, we got into fantasy, and fantasy comes in many forms. Sometimes it comes through novels. A lot of the time it comes through movies and TV shows, and they aren't always of top quality, but they're always very entertaining. And that's what we aim for with They Came From. Of course, we consider it top quality, but more than anything else, we want the They Came From games to be extremely entertaining for the people who read them and play them. And I think Cyclops' Cave hits that out of the park, as they say on the sports field.
Absolutely. And one of the things, it's funny you mentioned Masters of the Universe, because while the film, quite laughable, the animated version, why can't I speak today, of the property is dear to a lot of people's hearts. And
yeah.
Honestly, like, while again all of the inspirations that you just discussed, you can feel them in this manuscript. It really nails the tone, every bit of it. But having said that, the first thing I thought as I was looking through the character types was something along the lines of like He-Man. I could play a He-Man and the Masters of the Universe game with this.
Yeah.
I could play Thundar the Barbarian with this. It really kind of struck out to me as those levels, because you have the mechanisms for having these fantasy worlds that inexplicably also have like a sports van with treads for tires.
Yes,
and laser pistols.
I can picture that animation right now as well. And I noticed Velvet T in the chat, because I'm everywhere. Has just mentioned your Hunter from the Future, or Yours World, He's the Man, as the soundtrack when it was Yours World, He's the Man, Yours World, and he was basically a caveman, but in a sort of dystopian apocalyptic future. And that was starring Reb Brown, who was in many an MST3K movie of the week, I guess. And yeah, Yours World is also, for me, a strong influence on Cyclops' Cave. I don't know if we got it in the inspiration list, but it's one of these Masters of the Universe-ish, He-Man, like Conan, like it's just on the line of sword and sorcery and I guess what would be considered sword and sandals. But it's not very good. But it's very watchable and fun. The kind of thing you will have a drink or two while you're watching, have a laugh with your friends, your mates, as we call them in this country. And yeah, I again, that's a cause for happiness. We want movies that make us smile. We want games that make us smile. I certainly do. I spend a lot of time working on games that cause a great deal of introspection, or have mysteries at the heart of them, or make you feel a bit sad but glad you had the experience. And they're all great. They are. I love them. But at the same time, I want more games that are just fun, that people can sit down, especially if they've had a bad day, they can sit down and play a They Came From, and they will start laughing within the first 15-20 minutes. And by the end of the game, they may not be thinking, well, that's made me think a lot about my childhood. Right. They may not be thinking, wow, that was a character arc my character went through, but they will be smiling and they will be thinking, that was tremendous fun. I can't wait to go back and play it again. So I think, yeah.
I was going to say one thing that I do want to touch on about Cyclops' Cave before we move beyond that at all, is one of the things that strikes me as interesting about the They Came From line is, despite the fact that there are several genres now that are sort of being touched on, they're all written, and it's not... I think you do a very good job in these books of threading the needle between leaving the comedy to the table, but seeding it throughout the manuscript, so that there's kind of a feeling like you're getting that impression as you're reading these books that these are meant for fun, to be funny, to be enjoyable, to steer into the humor a bit, right? Would that be? Yeah. Would you say that's fair to say?
Yeah. I mean, it's. We always want the games to be fun to read. I have owned too many role-playing games that read like an encyclopedia, and sometimes they are encyclopedias, right. And sometimes they can be used as encyclopedias where you just pull the bits you need at any given time. That can be fine, but They Came From is written to be fun to read. And on the subject, I guess, of comedy, that's, I guess, inherent or implicit or explicit. They Came From is a game, all of them are games where the tools are deliberately sort of advertised as these can be fun to use if you want to use them, because not every gamer, not every role player, not every GM or director is comedic or is skilled at improv, especially comedy improv. And in fact, I would say the vast majority aren't. Plenty of people can be funny, but it's often once every now and then. It's not bam, 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 punchline after punchline, not a Zucker Brothers movie. But with They Came From, the quips, the cinematics, the tropes, all of these added layers, and you can have them all, or you can keep the ones you want and remove the rest. It doesn't break the system at all. They all add the, I guess, frequency of comedy, or the frequency of a chance of comedy, because and that you've got tools there that do it for you, so you can do it. You can feel glad for the fact that you've done it because you have made people laugh and made yourself smile by thinking this would be a silly quip to use at this time. But the onus isn't on you to come up with the humor. Now, you may well come up with your own humor during the course of the game. Comedy often fuels comedy, but it's written into the text in this way so that people can play it in a fun way without feeling like, oh shit, I've got to be a comedian tonight, because it's all on your character sheet. It's all in the book. Right. And I think that's quite different to a lot of games.
Well, I think it also achieves a very interesting mechanical way of taking people. Like, you may have a person, you may be a player who is more of a rules lawyery, like crunchy type. You're there because you want to do the tactical stuff. You want to do the more gamified side of things. But this even gives players like that those tools and incentives to still participate in the sort of joyous nature of playing those quips and using those tropes, because those are going to give them their system boost, right? And as you
Yeah.
said, comedy breeds comedy. So once you get into that groove, it's all the more easy to get into it. And part of the reason I wanted to touch base on that was just in case there's anybody watching that wasn't familiar kind of with the overall tone of They Came From, but also because in Cyclops' cave, it reads like it's leaning even heavier into the sort of just grandiose, the joy of the experience, as being its guiding star a little bit more than even comedy. And maybe that's a personal reading of it or whatnot, but I was pleasantly surprised when I saw that, because I don't think there's anything in Cyclops' cave that takes away from the comedy by any stretch of the imagination. But there seems to be kind of a a lantern hung on the sort of just general bombastic joy of these sort of high level fantasy stories. And I guess could you
Yeah.
talk about that a little bit? Was that a deliberate choice, or is that just kind of the way that things came together?
Yeah, well, that's a question of tone, really, because each of the They Came From games has a slightly different tone. People may not pick up on that, but it is true. And I guess I always think of it as Beneath the Sea is farce. It's just nonsense, and Beneath the Sea is the broadest comedy game out of the They Came Froms. Would I have placed it first in retrospect? Possibly not, but I think it's the most accessible in the sense that 1950s B movies are just silly. They
Yeah.
are often just ridiculous to look at, to sit through. And it's why Ed Wood is such a big inspiration and remains such an icon of that kind of feature. Then you get into Beyond the Grave, which has a very, I guess, almost overwrought hammy tone to it. I'd be more on the hammy and wooden at the same time. It's written in almost Vincent Price narrator voice, and so whenever you've got the narrator talking or the director talking, it's all bombastic, and then you get the characters talking and it's incredibly wooden and out of place, because again it's trying to invoke something of Hammer horror and the way that was. You get into Cyclops' cave, and as you say, it's grandiose, it's pompous, it's everything you would be mocked for, in a way, for being a fan of fantasy. So if a character in a movie would say something like, by the moons of Amunkara, by the blade of Schnizzlefarts, I shall run thee through, blah, 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 it sounds utterly ridiculous, utterly nonsense. And someone who doesn't like fantasy will probably say, this is rubbish to you as they're watching it. And you are forced to concede, yeah, it is, but it's also fun.
Right, it's
It's
fun
fun.
rubbish.
Yeah. All this melodrama that is poured into fantasy, especially the epic stuff, it's great. It's fantastic fuel, and not many role-playing games. So many role-playing games play coy with it.
Right.
I love plenty of fantasy games, but by design, they don't want to embrace the nonsense. They want their world to be seen as serious. You wouldn't get someone in A Song of Ice and Fire, and rightly so. You wouldn't get someone in A Song of Ice and Fire saying, you might actually, by the seven gods, the old and the new, I shall run thee through with my. Yeah, they probably would, but it wouldn't sound as ridiculous as some wise old mage on a mountain booming it, and their voice echoing across the valleys and hitting the ears of every noble warrior who now feels girded and can draw their weapons and take out the Cyclops, for instance. But Cyclops' cave is that. It allows you to play up rather than tone down.
Right.
And it, as you say, it's a definite style decision in each of the They Came From games. We want it to feel indulgent and celebrate the sheer, I guess, here's a word you don't hear often, the elasticity of fantasy. Because yeah, you can play it muted. You can play your deep introspective warrior who's had to retreat to the cabin because their entire family was murdered by the lich sorcerer, whatever. But and that's actually a fine place to start, because then we get the story of why this warrior came back to civilization to do this and that, and now they will intone, "This is for my wife, this is for my children," blah 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 blah. And with every single added statement, their chest is puffing up and up and and their sword is getting longer and longer. And yes, there may be a metaphor there, but it's fun. That's what people, or some people, enjoy. And certainly when we were doing a lot of play testing with Cyclops Cave, I know I was. It was like I was role playing with people who had been muzzled or had been forced to keep the gloves on for their entire role-playing lives, and now they are actually getting to play a game where, oh, we can just enjoy ourselves.
Right, we can just cut loose.
We can make Monty Python and the Holy Grail quotes and not feel guilty about it.
Exactly, and I think you touched on an interesting thing about kind of world building in general. That I think perhaps one of the things that has sort of helped with the success of They Came From and helped people enjoy it is that role-playing games as a hobby have reached a place culturally, not only just in the broader sense, but within the gaming community itself, where they've been around enough, they're familiar enough now that we can start to question some of those assumptions about a world that quote unquote takes itself too seriously. I don't think that's necessarily a good word choice, personally, in terms of taking itself too seriously. But you can look at it and you can sort of present that separation between player and character in a way that dives into the concept of the enjoyment differently than it does in other games, right? Because when somebody's meeting Dungeons and Dragons for the first time, you're giving them the ask to inhabit the mind of this character who lives in this world. And that They Came From games very much mechanically ask you to step aside and always keep in mind the puppet master pulling the strings. The player has agency that is divorced from the character's agency, which I think is a very interesting and cool concept and lets you dive into things, just all sorts of experiences that you wouldn't maybe have if you were just doing sort of a run-of-the-mill dungeon crawl or Elysium or what have you, in a world that is immersive, quote unquote, right? Is that?
Yeah. I mean, I think for a long time, obviously, it's going to be subjective. My take on it has been that over the early 2000s through to about 2015 or so, there was a big push for immersive gaming, that everything needed to be quite, I guess, deep-seated, that it was wrong to refer to your character in a third person, that it was that you had to take it all very seriously. And I ran loads of games during that period, and I enjoyed it. And I feel like since 2015, with the very much rise of smaller indie games, which of course many existed in the 10 years prior to that, but there was a real proliferation of that since 2015. Or thereabouts, you get a lot more interesting modes of play, and that includes the They Came From method, if I want to be as grand as to say that it has one, where metagaming is encouraged, where character and player are very much distinct, where you can even add to the idea of you being a player that effectively you are a producer and the character is an actor, or you are an actor and the character is your role, rather than you're a player and this is your character.
Right.
Or you can mix things around like that. And we don't go into heavy with that because much like with the comedy, we don't want to dictate to people, this is funny. We want to give you the tools to say, this can be entertaining if you play it this way.
Right.
If we try and say you will always be the producer and you are moving actors around like it's that old video game that was like Sims that most people have forgotten, where you are actually playing actors and Fame Studio or something like that. That can be fun. And I think a game that shares a lot of common DNA with They Came From, which I only found out about after working on They Came From, which was It Came From the Late 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 Show, does do that in a more called out fashion. But I think we provide enough flexibility that you can play it any way you like. It's just that we certainly don't lean on the idea that this has got to be a deep, immersive storytelling experience. Quite the contrary. This is supposed to be, for the most part, and change it as you like, a light-hearted gaming experience, if I guess that's a counterpoint on that spectrum.
Yeah, and you can absolutely play. You can sit down and play a at stone serious They Came From game. You can do it. There's nothing that gets in the way of that.
The very first actual play for They Came From, which was released, I think, outside of the demo Beneath the Sea that I did in person, that's on Onyx Path's YouTube channel with one of my gaming groups, was with Red Moon Role Playing, who I often run games with, and they're a fantastic crew. And this was my first game with them. And they were, and mostly still are, a horror podcast, predominantly horror role-playing games, and so they wanted to do Beneath the Sea as a horror game, and so we did it as a small town. I almost always set my games in this fictional Alabama town called Denton, on Alabama's very small piece of coastline, and it had a very it was a bit Lovecraftian, it was a bit Mississippi Burning. It was very creepy, and we played it in a way that the players were basically the great old ones. We had Nyarlathotep, Hastur, and Cthulhu. Strike me down for saying all three in the same breath. And the characters unknowingly were their avatars. And along with their quips that they had from the game itself, they also had this Cthulhuoid chant that each of them had that was specific to their great old one, that the player could make them do, and the character wouldn't be aware that they were doing it. It was much like a cinematic. And afterwards, something cataclysmic would happen. And this could be played exactly like a quick quip, but the world would get worse and worse for the characters every single time they used this quip. It wasn't a quip played in this usual way. And doing it like this showed me that the story path system, for one thing, is incredibly flexible. You can do horror, action, drama, whatever with it, and that works perfectly well. But most importantly for me, it showed that Beneath the Sea could be serious, it could be horrific, it can be anything you want. Just because there's a lot of humor in there doesn't mean you have to use it. The game itself functions just as well as a horror game or a Cold War game because of the era. You know, it all works. And I take a lot of pride in that, the fact it can be that flexible. And I'd love to hear that more groups are playing it like that. Although I think most groups, and this isn't a criticism, will play a game at face value because, you know, they'll buy it because of what they know it to be.
Right, they're buying it.
You don't buy Vampire the Masquerade to play a cyberpunk game, but you can buy They Came From Beneath the Sea, and once you've played a lot of fun, silly games, you can then say, well, hang on, let's now play this deadly serious and see how that goes.
So I think that's a great idea for a StoryPath Nexus creator. Let's get us a dead serious They Came From Beneath the Sea adventure. I promise you'll have at least one sale. I will buy that.
Well, you can do the layout for it, Travis. So I think you'll be eating into your own profits if you buy a copy.
Yeah, so be it. We do have a couple of questions I want to touch on real quick, and then I'd like to shift gears a little bit because we have been focusing quite a bit on Cyclops' Cave, and I want to talk about Classified. But before we get
Yeah.
into that, there was a question, and I believe someone had answered in the chat, but they were asking if you could have a mechanical owl as a pet. And someone else had pointed out in the chat that you can play one, which is
Yes.
true, but you also do. There is also a mechanism for having a mechanical owl pet so you can kind of slice it a couple different ways in Cyclops' cave. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, yeah. So one of my favorite things about They Came From, I never speak about enough, is the tropes. And tropes are, for all intents and purposes, you could consider them feats, you could consider them, I guess, class-based benefits, or you can consider them charms from Exalted, or whatever. They are special abilities that aren't restricted to specific archetypes, but are easier for certain archetypes to access. And one of these includes something like a mechanical owl. You know, you can have Archimedes or something similar. But also you can play the puppet. The puppet is an archetype which doesn't necessarily have to be a puppet. It can just look like a puppet. So you could play Rigel from Farscape. You could play that awful Orko placeholder that's in the Master of the Universe movie. Anything that could constitute the role of puppet. So rake your mind across Jim Henson's catalog and you'll find something fun to play. But one of the reasons I really love tropes, and one of the reasons I wish I spoke about them more and should endeavor to do so, is because of the sheer number of them. They are all different. Every game has somewhere between, I think, 10 and 15 per archetype. And now we have got, and I think I counted these up recently as well. So there's 5 archetypes in Beneath the Sea. There are 13 archetypes in Beyond the Grave, because there's 5 in Beyond the Grave, 5 in Camp Murder Lake, 3 in Heroes in a World of Horror. There's 6 in Cyclops' Cave, and there's 5 in Classified. Every single one of these has different tropes.
And not to correct your math, but I think there's like 2 more in Beneath the Sea from Tasty Bits.
God damn it! I think you're right. Yeah. What am I doing? I'm writing these Tasty Bits. But yes, point is that not only do you have all these options for you as a player straight off the bat, the crossover compatibility between They Came Froms is such that you can take tropes from Beneath the Sea and put them in Classified. You can take tropes from Beyond the Grave and put them in Camp Murder Lake, or from Camp Murder Lake into Cyclops' Cave. Same with the archetypes, same with the antagonists, same with the cinematics, same with the quips. They can all be crossed over, and the games are still incredibly playable, to the degree that, and I've said this on the Discord, the Onyx Path Discord, I am currently running a long Classified game. It's going very well, thank you very much for asking. And the players, we've got 2 players who are playing Classified archetypes, and one of the players is playing a survivor from They Came From Beneath the Sea, and one of the players is playing a mystic from They Came From Beyond the Grave, because the game started with a live and let die style plot. And the mystic is your solitaire-like character played by Jane Seymour in the movie, Fortune Teller. And our survivor is a grizzled old vet from out on the bayou. And it just kind of works. It's someone who knows the lay of the land, knows the locals, knows some of the conspiracies and drug trafficking going on around here. So because there wasn't an archetype that perfectly fit that character, as far as the player was concerned and Classified, they just pulled one from Beneath the Sea, and it just works.
Right.
Because the rules don't change between the games. It's just the options do.
Well, and one of the things that I thought was particularly, I'm a designer, like I nerd out about game design stuff, probably why I do what I do for a living. But the one of the things that I thought was really a brilliant design decision was just the fact that the tropes rules are self-contained. They all are within the trope itself. So yeah, popping them around from place to place doesn't really bring any mechanical weight baggage to another setting.
No, no. I mean, the tropes aren't necessarily what one might consider balanced.
Right.
But that's because they are built for a narrative purpose rather than white room combat. Most of them will do, at the simplest, they'll provide you with enhancements or an enemy with complications. And usually the number of enhancements doesn't vary to any significant degree. It's usually around 2 enhancements. But then you'll get tropes like one of my favorite ones in Beneath the Sea is having access to a nuclear bunker or an atomic device
Right.
of your choosing. And you can define that and you can use it as you will. You can only use it once in the story, just like you can only access your nuclear bunker once in the story. Now, does that constitute more than a level 2 enhancement? I don't know because it's narrative, but it's all part of building an interesting character. It's less about, well, I've now got more points than you on my sheet, and it's more about this makes my character more interesting for me, the player, and hopefully the story as well.
Right, and that same logic is drawing or driving all of the tropes across all the lines. So you're not contending with anything different. It's the same thing in the difference in tropes between, a sage and a scoundrel in Cyclops' cave, as it would be between a sage and a dupe from Beyond the Grave. So the other question, and you touched on this a little bit, and I want to expand on it a little bit as well. The question they asked was, with so many games coming out from the TCF line, are there any existing rules or plans for such rules to allow you to use the same terrible B-movie actor from one terrible genre film to the next across lines, or is that more of a meta-narrative, is the question that they asked you in the chat.
Well, it is more meta because we don't really detail the actor in They Came From. Because again, it's the player's choice really, whether the player is playing the actor or a producer, and the actor's the person being moved around like a pawn on a chessboard. But I think it's very easy to use the example from my classified game. If the person playing a survivor in classified, we get to the end of our classified campaign and we start up a Beneath the Sea game, well, it's very easy for that character to come back and just be in the Beneath the Sea game now with the exact same stats. If you needed to change a character's archetype, then it would be a little different because you could say, well, they're probably going to need new tropes, new quips, things like that now. But to be honest, Story Path is an incredibly flexible system. You can easily just knock a couple of dots off here and add a couple of dots on there, and it will still balance out. And so if you wanted to have an actor role that is jumping between different They Came Froms, really you are kind of doing that by playing lots of They Came Froms. But a good example is Red Moon Role Playing. I have recorded a They Came From Classified actual play and a They Came From the Cyclops' Cave actual play with them, and they will be releasing them over the forthcoming weeks. In in Classified, we have Ramona, who is a quartermaster in Classified, and we have Gustav, who is an operative, very handsome Swedish operative, a dashing type, and we have Miles, who is a stuntman turned actor, who is more there for the thrill of it. Now, we decided, because we've got the same 3 players in Cyclops' Cave, we would have Miles, who is basically an ogre-like satyr inhuman in Cyclops' Cave, Ramonas, a sage in Cyclops' Cave, and Gustav, a He-Man-like or more Conan-like champion in Cyclops' Cave. And it's very clear that these are the same actor characters in both games, played by the same people. But it's also for the audience to decide. They've certainly got the same names and some of the same behaviors, and in fact some of the same plot points pop up because I'm either a very lazy director or a very clever one.
Excellent. And yeah, and there are mechanics that allow for crafting a custom path. So if you wanted to like make your origin path an actor, you could do that.
Yep.
And there are mechanics for switching your archetype. I think in every game, right? Because of like a dramatic change. Like I think you can switch
Yeah.
your dark
Yeah.
agendas um, in the you're not switching your archetype. You're switching your agenda path or your goal path, basically.
Yeah, yeah. It's so in Beneath the Sea, we only barely touched on it because it was our first stab at they came from, and with each increasing, or I guess further they came from, we've got a little bolder with the idea of changing paths. And for instance, as you say, in Beyond the Grave, it's dark agenda, which up until not the last minute, but pretty damn close, it was ambition still, like in
Oh, yeah.
Beneath the Sea. And it was only, I think, after the Kickstarter that I thought, you know what, because I was already thinking that we're doing cover in classified instead of ambition. Let's do dark agenda and Beyond the Grave to give characters a bit of a darker edge to them. Now, very negative word, can't say edge anymore, but that is what a dark agenda is. And so there's a bit of incongruity in Beyond the Grave, because while most of the ambition turned dark agendas do have a dark twist, some of them are like dark agenda, be the best babysitter on the block. But they really come into their own, and they came from Camp Murder Lake. And then with Cyclops' Cave, they have quests. And yeah, quests, cover identities, dark agendas, to a lesser extent, ambitions in Beneath the Sea can change pretty readily. But you can change any path in theory in They Came From. I think the experience or character creation rules don't necessarily advise it. But I think that third point of the tri-corner path is perfectly flexible.
And the other thing that question had brought up to me, and it was a point that I thought about earlier, I just wanted to touch on real quick, is the idea of doing, like you could, I think it would be fun to see or play in a campaign where you have like characters from each setting, almost as if they've been ripped out of their films, where you do like a They Came From UHF, where for some
Yeah.
reason the meta is that these characters are traveling about like, the Exiles comic or like Sliders, bouncing from film to film. So you've got your fantasy champion next to your quartermaster, next to your, dupe, and you're hopping around. That would be another way that I think that you could really sort of explore and play with the genre
Well,
with these games.
I know I've mentioned it a few times now, but the Masters of the Universe film, that bad one, with, yes, I know Frank Langella was very, very good in it, but that is about all that is good in that movie. Is a reverse Isekai movie, because you've got characters coming over from Eternia to Earth. You have a fantasy protagonists in it's not quite cyberpunk because it's modern, but it feels very grungy. It's almost a Detroit feel, and so it does blend those genres nicely, because you can have the other protagonists, the normal protagonists, I guess, the Courtney Cox and family. It's not her parents, I think they're dead. From memory, that they could be your dupe. They could be, your characters from Camp Murder Lake at that point. So yeah, there's you can have lots of mix and match, and They Came From. I encourage it.
A lot of fun. And speaking of a lot of fun, we've spent a lot of minutes going over Cyclops' Cave, which I love. So let's dig into Classified a little bit. I know next week is kind of the big where we're going to see some big reveals in the Kickstarter. But what sort of, are there some things coming up you can tease us about it? Or are there some things that you want to just put out there on Front Street about Classified? Let's hear some about that spy movie inspired game.
So, as with all They Came From, Classified can be played serious or camp. And so whether you're doing Jason King and Department S, or The Prisoner, or The Avengers, John Cena and Emma Peel, not Captain America, or I guess, Daniel Craig era Bond or Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, sort of grim and gritty spy thrillers, it functions and plays really well either way. You've got 5 archetypes, as I mentioned. Each fulfills a certain bracket within the espionage genre. All characters are spies by kind of definition. You have the operative, you've got the quartermaster, you've got the adventurer, you've got. Actually, I'm not going to ruin all of them. I mean, some of you will know all of these archetypes because we have done an actual play last year, I think with Vorpal Tales, where these will have come up, but I won't ruin all of them. So if you want to look forward to the manuscript. But we also have some of the additional features that were introduced in Camp Murder Lake, like twists. Twists appear in Classified along with your other Quip cinematics. And fiendish plots. Fiendish plots are an introduction for Classified, where if you need to come up with a story on the fly, it's just a case of placing cards down, and you've got this is the villain who wants to do this with this device, and or it's who this part of the world. And it's a very easy way to just form a plot, and you can do this with the players or you can do it on your own. In many ways, Classified has been my favorite they came from to develop and write on. And I don't know necessarily why. I think it's mostly the tone of it. There's something you don't have to be members of a British agency. But when I was writing it in my development phase, adding bits to it, ironing out the tone, evening it out, I was throwing in an awful lot of, now listen here, agent, put down that macaroon and listen to me, in the director text that's running through the book. And because of that, it makes it a lot of fun to read. It makes it feel like you're on a briefing. I'm also, I would say, I favor, and by no means am I putting down any of the they came from. I think we all have our favorite child, and whether they like it or not.
Yeah, that's true.
The example text in Classified is probably my favorite as well. One of my favorite things that I added quite late, and all credit to the authors on this as well. This isn't just my work I'm celebrating, but I just had so much fun writing the unfortunate arc of Agent Locke, who is a character who basically gets introduced in the stunts fiction, I think, just the little example text before each stunt. And he's just getting increasingly ground down until I think an assassin takes him out, and then appears again in the Rogues Gallery chapter as basically an agent who's lost his memory or has just thought, oh, sod this agency crap. I'm doing nothing but getting shat on. And my favorite line in it is, and it doesn't make much sense out of context, where his balls get slapped. A firm slap, I think it is. It's one of these examples that starts with, come, Agent Locke, and he says, I'm trying. And it's all part of a debriefing, I say. And by the end of it, he just, the person debriefing him just gives his balls a slap and walks away from it. A very unsatisfying conclusion for Agent Locke. But yeah, it's a lot of silly fun, of course, and it talks about a genre that I used to enjoy a hell of a lot. And I say used to, I still enjoy. But when I was, thank you for the Austin Powers Dr. Evil quote there in the chat. When I was in my late teens and early 20s, I loved Bond movies. I was into all of them, watched all of them, read up on all of them. I still have a ridiculous amount of Bond trivia locked away in my head that I can pull on for no good reason. But I kind of moved past Bond at the same time as I moved past Star Wars. At some point, I just thought, okay, I'm going to embrace, I don't know, more mature sci-fi, more mature espionage. And oddly, before Bond, I was well, not necessarily oddly, but before Bond, I was really into the Avengers and the Man from U.N.C.L.E. and the Champions and Get Smart and TV secret agents. And as I got older, I really went back into that, and I found that kind of novel approach toward espionage, that whimsical approach toward death and I guess information theft and spying on people and robots and other weird shit really appealed to me, because it wasn't trying to take itself seriously. And then only recently I really started getting back into the Bond movies and found most of them are pretty flawed, but most of them pretty enjoyable. And so all of this sort of channeled into Classified, along with Austin Powers as well. I do like the Austin Powers movies. I saw the latter two of them in the cinema, and I still think the humor holds up in a lot of places. But it also draws inspiration from things like Ipcris File and in like Flint and John le Carre's work. So Classified, just like all the other they came from, pulls from so many different places, and for me is, I guess, almost a pure distillation, to go a bit Promethean, of a movie genre a media genre that I just adore, for so many different reasons.
And so what it can often be, I find, a challenge when you're getting too close creatively to something that you have great reverence for.
Yeah.
Were there any challenges that you particularly experienced with regards to that, or any things where you knew, maybe even just going in like from the front, like this is going to be the hard thing to do, or this is going to be the most fun thing to do? Was there an element, because of your closeness with the genre, I guess, that particularly stood out while you were putting the book together?
Yeah, I mean, oddly, for Classified, most of the problems were ones that came up in Beneath the Sea. And so they were things I had already addressed, but they reared their head again with Classified, perhaps more so than with Beyond and Cyclops. And it was, to get all serious for a moment, that in a lot of spy movies, there's a shitload of misogyny, a lot of racism, and what's more, the protagonists are almost always white men. And when black characters or characters of color should happen to turn up, they often tend to be sidekicks who end up on the sacrificial altar pretty rapidly. I mean, the very first Bond movie, I guess the first Eon Bond movie in the form of Dr. No, even has Quarrel, who is Bond's man on the island, who he basically gets burned alive through his own negligence. And that's your first introduction, to a black man in the Bond franchise, and that doesn't happen again for some time. So I've encountered this in Classified as well. Even the espionage media that I love is often very, very white. And so the way to address it is often by highlighting the misogynists, the bigots, as idiots. We found this in Beneath the Sea as well, and Beyond the Grave, where it can be all right to have a villain or an imbecile protagonist say, I wouldn't have expected that from a woman, and then for the woman to actually show that this character is full of it. It would usually be, I mean, the example I often pull out is the man makes some ridiculous comment to the woman. The woman then gets in her car, which she has fixed herself, drives off, leaving him in the middle of the desert to
Right.
think about what a moron he is. And we've done that, we've portrayed that a fair amount in Classified, I would say, and in the art as well. We're not just depicting white men in tuxedos, and so that kind of helps solve the problem. You can't get around it. I've mentioned a few times there are some genres, I often mention westerns, which have a really problematic approach to diversity, to racism. And sometimes I think, well, that's a hurdle I would really like to tackle, and sometimes I feel like it's a hurdle I really don't want to tackle, because it's difficult to tackle it and still stay true as a light-hearted genre game.
Right.
But with Classified, Beneath the Sea, and Beyond the Grave, again, didn't come up that much in Cyclops' Cave. The lack of said diversity is best addressed by making it diverse and making characters who are against that sort of thing out to be cretins. And it kind of fixes itself by doing that.
And not a difficult sell to make. You know what I mean? That the ignorant person is ignorant.
Well, I like to think so.
And yeah, so in terms of we talked a bit about the cinematics, the quips, the things along those lines from Cyclops' Cave, and I know we can't give away too much because the manuscript isn't even out to the backers yet for these things for Classified. But is there something that you can maybe give us a little tease of or talk about a little bit that you felt really sort of nails the genre in terms of one of those mechanical levers, like a particular trope that jumps out at you or a particular cinematic that you're like, this was especially spy, right? Because some of the cinematics and whatnot, they exist in all the games. You can have a missing reel anywhere. You can always drop in a missing reel and it's going to make sense. But is there something that leaps out as like, oh, this really was flavor, complete flavor of the genre?
Well, in a way, it's to my regret. It's split. It's to my regret, but also immense gratification that the cinematics we know best are in Beneath the Sea. There's very little duplication across any of the they came from, because I've always been of the mind these games should stand on their own and then be crossed over if you wish. So although everyone knows the missing reel, the deleted scene, the cheap set, and so on, that while there is some duplication between Beneath the Sea and Beyond the Grave, I think it's probably as many as 5.
Yeah,
and then you get into Classified, Cyclops' Cave, and Camp Murder Lake, which is a pretty sizable source book, and they are all unique. Feel free to correct me if you find any that aren't. And Classified has some wonderful spy movie, I guess, tropes in the forms of cinematics, such as the establishing shot, which basically allows you to narrate in fact, I'm not going to tell you exactly what they do, because this can be the fun of when the manuscript comes out. But we have cinematics with names like establishing shot. We have bringing a gun to a knife fight. And you can probably guess what some of these things do. Previously on Classified, one of my favorites is just looking for the bathroom, which basically I will tell you what that enables you to do. And that's basically walk through the enemy's secret lair. Just like, I was just looking for the bathroom. I always default to Roger Moore. I do Roger Moore a lot easier than Sean Connery. Not just a pen. I wonder what that does.
Right, sure.
And I also, in a lot of Classified games I have run, Roger Moore is always the villain. I mean, I've played Classified as well, and of course I played Roger Moore in that. But if you have
a go-to voice,
very well.
If you have a go-to voice, use it. Almost for probably a good 10 years, every dragon I ever ran in any game spoke exactly like Sean Connery in Dragonheart. I am the last one. Because if you have
There's
a
a
game of
wonderful there's a wonderful story about Roger Moore that when he was that it was shortly after he died. There was a journalist who you may have read it. Recounted an encounter with Roger Moore when he was a kid. He saw Roger Moore in a flight departure lounge and went up to him and with his granddad and he asked his granddad, "Can you get this James Bond to write an autograph for me?" And so his granddad went up and Roger Moore dutifully signed his name, gave it to the granddad. Granddad gave it to the kid, and he said, this doesn't say James Bond. This says Roger Moore. He's not signed his real name." And so the granddad went back up to him and said, not knowing who James Bond was, he says, "This isn't your name." And so Roger Moore brought the grandkid close and said, "Actually, I am James Bond, but I can't sign my name as James Bond because Blofeld's agents could be anywhere. So Roger Moore is my code name, but don't tell anyone." And the kid was pleased as punch. This is fantastic, best encounter with Roger Moore that he could ever have. And then about 20 years later, 30 years later, Roger Moore's doing a lot of UNICEF work. This kid has grown up to be a journalist who was working with UNICEF, and he bumps into Roger Moore on one of these UNICEF drives and says, "You probably don't remember this, but I met you in an airport 30 years ago and he retold the story." And Roger Moore said, "I don't remember that at all, but it sounds delightful." And they parted ways. End of the day, the journalist is leaving, crosses paths with Roger Moore in the corridor, and Roger Moore stops him and says, "Actually, I do remember our encounter in the airport, but I couldn't tell you in front of the cameramen at UNICEF because Blofeld's agents could be anywhere." And he just raised his eyebrow and walked off. And for me, that's wonderful. It's completely unrelated to all this, but I love when an artist, a creative who you might look up to, or you might think, "Wow, that guy has so much fun and screen presence," actually turns out to be a decent person. It seems to happen all too rarely these days.
It does. It does.
It fuels my desire to play Roger Moore in every classified game I ever run.
Well, that is a beautiful story and a beautiful sentiment, and I think a beautiful place to probably wrap us up. I think we're at or about time. Before we do sign off for the evening, is there any last bits you'd like to share with the viewing audience, just regarding the double feature or regarding the Kickstarter?
Well, as always, I will say to the lovely, lovely audience, thank you very much for watching, but also They Came From is a new game, and it may not feel like it, but ultimately this isn't an established line in the same way as Vampire or D&D or Cyberpunk or one of these other games that's been around since the 80s is. And so with every Kickstarter, we need to draw new people. We need to attract new fans. We need to build this up for it to do well, for us to make new books. And what that translates to is it is absolutely fantastic that you back it. We want for you to back it. Of course we do. But we also need for you to share it. We need you to tell people. We need you to go to your gaming groups. We need you to tell your friends. We need you to go on social media. We need you to extol the virtues of this game, because we will do it. We always do it. If you keep up my Twitter, you'll see that I'm posting about it every single day. But social media these days is the way we reach out to people, and the best way that we can utilize social media is through the people that follow us. So if you love these games, if you find them appealing, please tell others about why you think they're so fantastic and why you think they would love them. Because I personally think Cyclops Cave and Classified are, well, but naturally they are the cleanest of the They Came Froms in terms of quality, because we've had 5 goes now, if you include Camp Murder Lake, to get this far. Each time we're refining the process, each time we're making the games that much better. And if you know people who love fantasy, if you know people who love espionage, and there aren't that many espionage games out there, and there certainly aren't that many sword and sandals fantasy games or sword and sorcery fantasy games, despite the fact, sword and sorcery Scarred Lands, but let's forget about that. Great game, by the way. That really evoke that cinematic fantasy genre. I like to call it a cinematic fantasy game, a cinematic espionage game. That's what they are. So tell people about them. It really is appreciated, and hopefully we'll get to fund some fun stretch goals. As you will be able to see, the next stretch goal is unlocking some very Schwarzenegger-esque archetypes, and hopefully you can imagine that if we fund even more stretch goals, we could do a little more that's a bit Schwarzenegger-esque, but it depends on what we get to fund.
Absolutely. And just let me first of all, thank you so much for taking the time and for working with us in the schedule and getting this together. It's been a hectic week on the Twitch channel. If you check out the schedule, we're pretty packed this week. So thank you for taking the time for the discussion. I just want to piggyback on what you said. I too love to see this stuff being shared around. I love it when people tag me in stuff. If you're sharing stuff regarding a Kickstarter that we've got going, or if you want to go on and talk on TikTok about your character that you're making for a They Came From game, or a Scarred Lands game, or a Trinity game, whatever, tag me in it. I'll reshare your stuff. I love to see that stuff. I love to see it out in the world. And the best way to make sure that we can continue making games like this and make more of them and expand on them is to get them in front of people. And the best way to do that is for you who's watching this to be getting it in front of as many people as you can and sharing with them. I also would like to just add a little bit of extra on the end of it. I think They Came From the Cyclops' Cave is the perfect gateway drug if you have a group that loves D&D. And I'm not trying to punch the giant in the room. I'm just saying it is a nice transition. I think if you want to get your D&D group to try a different game. They Came From the Cyclops' Cave is going to be just familiar enough that they're going to be able to grasp what you're doing, and just different enough, I think, to spark that love that all of us have discovered at one point, which is for games that aren't the elephant in the room. I think that's fair to say. I hope that's fair to say.
I know it's going to be a hard sell to convince those players of Wizards that they can't fire magic missiles as their first level spell. But, they can get magical effects instead, and that's even better, in my opinion.
Exactly. There you go. There's a whole world, several of them, many worlds, one might say, that they can explore. But once again, Matthew, thank you so much for taking the time. I want to thank the audience and remind you that They Came From the Cyclops' Cave is currently on Kickstarter, along with They Came From Classified in a double feature. There are trailer videos floating around various social medias that you can share with your friends as you're talking about these fine games. You'll be able to watch an actual play this weekend at 11 p.m. Eastern. I will be playing in an actual play of They Came From the Cyclops' Cave, and I'll be running it next week, sometime to be determined. We also have actual plays running on Red Moon Role Playing for They Came From Classified, and I expect we will have a They Came From Classified on this channel next week as well. Once again, keep an eye. Best place to learn about all that stuff is the Monday Meeting Notes, where the new schedule is posted each week.
Absolutely.
Thank you all so much again. Everybody take care of yourselves and each other. Make sure you're getting your shots and wearing your masks and washing your hands and all that fun stuff. And we will see you again real soon. Bye.